Chapter 25. On Language and Words. Section 306. The animal voice serves only the expression of the will in its excitement and movements. The human voice, however, serves also the expression of knowledge. Connected with this is the fact that the former almost always makes an unpleasant impression on us, except for a few bird songs. In the origin of human language, the first thing was certainly the interjections, which express not concepts but, like the sounds of animals, feelings, movements of the will. Their various types quickly emerged, and from their variation came the transition to substantives, verbs, pronomina personalia, etc. Section 307. It is well known that languages, particularly in grammatical respects, are the more perfect the older they are, and they gradually become always worse, descending from High Sanskrit to the English jargon, this garment of thought composed of scraps of heterogeneous materials. This gradual degradation is a significant argument against the popular theories of our so soberly smiling optimists concerning the steady progress of humanity toward the better, for which purpose they would like to distort the deplorable history of the biped species. Moreover, it is a problem difficult to solve. We cannot but imagine the first human species that somehow emerged from the bosom of nature to be in a state of utter and childish ignorance, and consequently crude and helpless. How then could such a species have conceived these highly artful linguistic structures, these complicated and manifold grammatical forms? Even assuming that the vast vocabulary was only gradually collected. At the same time, we see everywhere else that descendants adhere to the language of their parents and only gradually introduce small changes to it. But experience does not teach that languages perfect themselves grammatically in the succession of generations, but, as mentioned, quite the contrary, they become increasingly simpler and worse. Should we nevertheless assume that the life of language resembles that of a plant, which, having emerged from a simple germ, gradually develops into a modest sapling, reaches late maturity, and from there gradually declines again as it ages, and that we have only knowledge of this decay but not of the earlier growth? This is a merely figurative and moreover completely arbitrary hypothesis. A comparison, no explanation. To achieve such an explanation, the most plausible assumption seems to me to be that man invented language instinctively, in that an instinct originally lies within it, by virtue of which he produces this indispensable tool and organ of his reason without reflection and conscious intent. An instinct that afterwards, when language exists and is no longer needed, disappears. Just as all works produced purely by instinct, e.g., the construction of bees, wasps, beavers, and the nests of birds in such manifold and always purposeful forms, etc., possess a peculiar perfection peculiar to them, in that they are precisely and exactly what their purpose requires, so that we admire the deep wisdom that lies within them. So it is with the first and original language. It possessed the high perfection of all the works of instinct. To trace this instinct, to bring it into the light of reflection and distinct consciousness, is the work of the grammar that emerged only thousands of years later. Section 308. The word of man is the most durable material. If a poet has embodied his fleeting sentiment in rightly fitted words, it lives on in these words through millennia, and is newly awakened in every receptive reader. Section 309. The knowledge of several languages is not only an indirect, but also an immediate, deeply effective means of intellectual education. Hence the saying of Charles V, "As many languages as one knows, so many times he is a man." Quote linguis quis caulet, tot homines valet. The matter itself rests on the following. Not for every word in one language can the exact equivalent be found in every other. Therefore, not all concepts designated by the words of one language are precisely the same as those expressed by the words of another. Although this is mostly, sometimes even strikingly exact, as is the case for example with sigma upsilon lambda lambda alpha beta eta zeta and conceptio, Schneider and Taylor, but often they are merely similar and related concepts, yet differing by some modification. To clarify what I mean, the following examples may serve for now. Alpha mu epsilon iota delta kappa tau zeta, rudis, rho crude. Aromueta, impetus and rang rush. Mueta chi alpha nueta, middle, medium, means. Secator, qualgeist, important, bother / nuisance. Ingenieux, shinreich, clever, ingenious. Geist, esprit, wit, spirit / mind. Lustig, facetious, pleasant, merry / jolly. Malice, Boschheit, wickedness, malice. To which innumerable others and certainly even more striking ones could be added. In the visualization of concepts by circles, customary in logic, this inadequacy could be expressed by circles that approximately cover each other, yet are not entirely concentric, such as, sometimes a word for a concept is missing in one language, while it is found in most, perhaps even all others. A highly scandalous example of this is the lack of the verb to stand in French. For some concepts, a word is found only in one language which then passes into others, such as the Latin affect, the French naïve, the English comfortable, disappointment, gentleman, and many others. Sometimes, too, a foreign language expresses a concept with a nuance that our own does not give it and with which we are just thinking it. Then anyone concerned with a precise expression of his thoughts will use the foreign word, without worrying about the barking of pedantic purists. In all cases where not precisely the same concept is designated by a specific word in one language as in another, the way to render it is by the decomposition of this concept into several related expressions, which all meet the meaning of the concept, but not concentrically, but in different directions alongside it as in the figure above, thereby delimiting the boundaries within which it lies. Thus one will, for example, paraphrase the Latin honestum through wall anstandig, proper, Ehrenworth, honorable, ehrenvoll, full of honor, ansehnlich, respectable, tugendhaft, virtuous, etc., and the Greek avnueta operator, in an analogous manner. On this rests the necessarily defective nature of all translations. Almost never can one transfer any characteristic, pregnant, significant phrase from one language to another so that it produces exactly and perfectly the same effect. Even in mere prose, the very best translation will relate to the original at most as its transposition into another key relates to a given musical piece. Those familiar with music know what that entails. Therefore, every translation remains dead and its style forced, stiff, unnatural, or else it becomes free, i.e., contents itself with an à peu près approximation, and is therefore false. A library of translations resembles a picture gallery of copies. And then the translations of the writers of antiquity are a surrogate for them, like chicory coffee is for real coffee. Operator, the Greek word avnueta has no adequate equivalent in any language. Poems cannot be translated but merely repoeticized or paraphrased, which is always precarious. Accordingly, in learning a language, the difficulty lies primarily in becoming acquainted with every concept for which it has a word, even when one's own language possesses no word exactly corresponding to it, which is often the case. Therefore, in learning a foreign language, one must delineate several entirely new spheres of concepts in one's mind. Consequently, spheres of concepts arise where none were before. One thus learns not merely words but acquires concepts. This is particularly true when learning the ancient languages, because the mode of expression of the ancients is much more different from ours than that of the modern languages are from each other, which is shown by the fact that, when translating into Latin, one must resort to completely different turns of phrase than those in the original. Indeed, one must usually completely recast and reform the thought to be rendered in Latin, in which process it is broken down into its ultimate constituents and recomposed. It is precisely upon this that the great demand which the mind receives from the learning of the ancient languages rests. Only after one has correctly grasped all the concepts which the language to be learned designates through individual words, and thinks immediately of the concept corresponding exactly to each word, instead of first translating the word into one's mother tongue and then thinking of the concept designated by the latter, which does not always correspond exactly to the former, and likewise with regard to entire phrases. Only then has one grasped the spirit of the language to be learned and, therewith taken a great step toward the knowledge of the nation speaking it, for as the style is to the spirit of the individual, so is the language to that of the nation. People of limited capacity will not easily truly appropriate a foreign language. They may learn its words, but they always use them only in the sense of their approximate equivalent in their mother tongue and always retain the turns and phrases peculiar to the latter. They are simply unable to appropriate the spirit of the foreign language, which is actually due to the fact that their thinking itself does not proceed from its own resources, but is for the most part borrowed from their mother tongue, whose common phrases and idioms take the place of their own thoughts, which is why they also in their own language always use only worn-out phrases, hackneyed phrases, phrases banales, which they themselves even put together so clumsily that one notices how imperfectly conscious they are of their meaning and how little their whole thinking goes beyond the words, so that it is not much more than parroting. From the opposite reason, originality of phrases and individual appropriateness of every expression one uses is an infallible symptom of a superior mind. From all this, it now becomes clear that in learning every foreign language, new concepts are formed to give meaning to new signs, that concepts separate which otherwise only jointly form a wider, thus more indefinite one, simply because there was only one word for them, that relationships hitherto unknown are discovered, because the foreign language designates the concept through a trope or metaphor peculiar to it, that accordingly, An infinite number of nuances, similarities, differences, and relationships of things enter into consciousness through the newly learned language, that one thus obtains a more multifaceted view of all things. From this it follows that one thinks differently in every language, and therefore our thinking receives a new modification and coloring through the learning of each one, and consequently polyglottism, besides its many indirect benefits, is also a direct means of education for the mind, in that it corrects and perfects our views through the emergence of versatility and nuancing of concepts, as well as increases the agility of thought, since through the learning of many languages the concept increasingly detaches itself from the word. The ancient languages accomplished this to an incomparably greater extent than the modern ones, by virtue of their great difference from ours, which does not permit us to render word for word, but demands that we recast our entire thought and pour it into a different form. Or, to allow myself a chemical analogy, while translating from one modern language into another at most requires that the phrase to be translated be decomposed into its nearest components and recomposed from them, translating into Latin first requires a decomposition into its furthest and ultimate constituents, the pure thought content, from which it is then regenerated in completely different forms, so that, for example, what is expressed there by substantives is expressed here by verbs, or vice versa and so on. The same process takes place when translating from the ancient languages into the new ones, from which it can already be seen how remote the relationship with the ancient authors is that can be established through such translations. The Greeks were deprived of the advantage of language study, through which they certainly saved a lot of time, but which they then also managed less economically, as evidenced by the daily long loafing of free men on the agora, marketplace, which even reminds one of the Lazzaroni and the whole Italian activity in the piazza, public square. Finally, it is easy to see from what has been said that the imitation of the style of the ancients, in their own languages, which far surpass ours in grammatical perfection, is the very best means of preparing oneself for the fluent and perfect expression of one's thoughts in the mother tongue. To become a great writer, it is even indispensable, just as it is necessary for the aspiring sculptor and painter to train themselves by imitating the models of antiquity before proceeding to their own composition. Through writing Latin alone one learns to treat diction as a work of art, whose material is language, which must therefore be treated with the greatest care and circumspection. Accordingly, a heightened attention is now directed to the meaning and value of words, their arrangement, and the grammatical forms. One learns to weigh these precisely and thus to handle the precious material that is suitable for serving the expression and preservation of valuable thoughts. One learns to have respect for the language in which one writes so that one does not treat it arbitrarily and capriciously in order to remodel it. Without this preliminary training, writing easily degenerates into mere chatter. One who doesn't understand Latin resembles a person in a beautiful landscape in foggy weather. His horizon is extremely limited. He sees only what's nearest clearly, a few steps beyond that it vanishes into the indefinite. The horizon of the Latin speaker, however, extends very far through the newer centuries. The Middle Ages, antiquity, Greek or even Sanskrit, naturally widen the horizon by a considerable amount more. Anyone who doesn't understand Latin belongs to the masses, even if he were a great virtuoso on the electric machine and had the radical of fluorspar acid in the crucible. In your writers who don't understand Latin, you'll soon understand nothing but babbling barber apprentices. They're already well on their way with their Gallicisms and easy-going turns of phrase. To vulgarity, noble Teutons, you have turned, and vulgarity you will find. A true sign of laziness and a breeding ground for ignorance are the editions of Greek, and even, horrible dictu, Latin authors, ventured these days with German notes. What an infamy! How is the student supposed to learn Latin if he is always interrupted by his mother tongue? Therefore nil Latinum in schola, nothing Latin in school, was a good old rule. That the Herr Professor cannot easily write Latin, and the student cannot easily read it, that is the humor of the matter, pretend as you like. So laziness and its daughter ignorance are behind it, nothing else. And it is a shame. One has learned nothing and the other wants to learn nothing. Cigar smoking and idle chatter have in our days driven out scholarship, just as picture books for big children have replaced the literary journals. In Gymnasien, German secondary schools, Old German literature, the Nibelungen and other poets of the Middle Ages, should not be taught. These things are indeed highly remarkable and also worth reading, but they do not contribute to the cultivation of taste and steal the time that belongs to the ancient, truly classical literature. If you, noble Teutons and German patriots, substitute Old German rhymes for the Greek and Roman classics, you will raise nothing but lazy louts. Now, to compare these Nibelungen with the Iliad is a veritable blasphemy, from which the ears of the youth, above all, should be spared. Section 310. that, step by step with the increase of concepts, the vocabulary of a language should be increased, is right and even necessary. If, however, the latter occurs without the former, it is merely a sign of spiritual poverty that would nevertheless like to bring something to market and, since it has no new thoughts, comes up with new words. This kind of language enrichment is very much the order of the day and a sign of the times. But new words for old concepts are like a new color applied to an old garment. In passing, and merely because the example is at hand, let it be noted that one should use the former and the latter, ersters und letzters, only when, as above, each of these expressions represents several words, but not when only one, in which case it is better to repeat that single word, which the Greeks generally did not hesitate to do, while the French are most anxious to avoid it. The Germans sometimes blunder so much with their former and latter, that one no longer knows what is rear and what is front. Section 311. We despise the word script of the Chinese. But, since the task of all writing is to awaken concepts in the reason of the other through visible signs, it is obviously a great detour to first present to the eye only a sign of the audible sign of those concepts and only then to make the latter the carrier of the concept itself, whereby our alphabet is only a sign of the sign. The question thus arises, what advantage the audible sign has over the visible one to induce us to abandon the direct path from the eye to reason and to take such a great detour as having the visible sign speak to the foreign mind only through the mediation of the audible sign, especially since it would apparently be simpler, after the manner of the Chinese, to make the visible sign immediately the carrier of the concept and not merely the sign of the sound, all the more so since the sense of sight is susceptible to even more and finer modifications than that of hearing, and also allows for a simultaneity of impressions, which the affections of hearing, being exclusively given in time, are not capable of. The reasons inquired about here would probably be the following. We instinctively resort first to the audible sign, and specifically first to express our affects, but then also to express our thoughts. Through this we arrive at a language for the ear before we have even thought of inventing one for the eye. Afterwards, it is shorter to trace this latter, where it becomes necessary, back to the former, than to invent, or respectively to learn, a completely new, indeed, completely different language for the eye, especially since it was soon discovered that the number of words can be reduced to very few sounds and therefore easily expressed by means of these. Sight can indeed grasp more varied modifications than the ear, but we are not well able to produce such modifications for the eye without tools, as we are for the ear. Nor could we produce and alternate the visible signs with the speed with which, by virtue of the volubility of the tongue, we can produce the audible ones, as evidenced by the imperfection of the finger language of the deaf-mute. This, therefore, makes hearing fundamentally the most essential sense of language and thereby of reason. Accordingly, however, the reasons why the direct path is not the best here are at bottom only external and accidental, not arising from the essence of the task itself. Consequently, if we consider the matter abstractly, purely theoretically, and a priori, the procedure of the Chinese would remain the actually correct one, so that one could only accuse them of some pedantry, insofar as they disregarded the empirical circumstances that recommend a different path. In the meantime, experience has also brought to light an enormous advantage of the Chinese script. Namely, one does not need to know Chinese to express oneself in it, but everyone reads it in his own language, just like our numerals, which are generally to the number concepts what the Chinese characters are to all concepts, and the algebraic signs are this even for abstract concepts of magnitude. Therefore, as an English tea merchant who had been to China 5 times assured me, the Chinese script is the common medium of communication between merchants of different nations who do not share a common language in all the Indian seas. The man was even of the firm opinion that it would one day spread over the world in this capacity. A report entirely consistent with this is given by J. F. Davis in his work The Chinese, London 1836, chapter 15. The deponentia deponent verbs are the only irrational, indeed senseless, feature of the Latin language, and the media middle voice of the Greek language are not much better. However, a specific error in Latin is that the passive voice of facere, to make, is lacking here. This implicates and implants the ruinous error in the reason learning the language that everything that is, at least everything that has come into being, geworden, is something made, gemaktes. In Greek and German, however, gamma iota gamma nu epsilon sigma theta alpha iota and werden, to become, are not immediately considered passives of pi omicron iota epsilon omega and maken, to make. I can say in Greek, omicron upsilon kappa epsilon sigma ta iota pi alpha nu gamma omicron nu omicron nu pi omicron iota eta mu epsilon nu omicron nu, but this could not be translated literally into Latin, although it can into German. Nick jeds geworden ist an gemaktes, not everything that has come into being is a thing that has been made. Section 313. The consonants are the skeleton and the vowels are the flesh of the words. The former is, in the individual, immutable, the latter very mutable in color, quality and quantity. Therefore, words, as they wander through the centuries or even from one language to another, generally conserve their consonants very well but easily change their vowels, which is why in etymology the former must be considered much more than the latter. One can find all kinds of etymologies for the word superstitio compiled in Delrius Disquisitionibus Magicis, L. C. I, and likewise in Wes Exeter's in Stit. Theol. Dogmatica Proleg. C. I section 5d. I suspect, however, that the origin of the word lies in the fact that it originally designated merely the belief in ghosts, namely, defunctorum mani circumvagari, ergo mortuos ad hoc superstites esse. The spirits of the dead wander around, therefore the dead are still surviving. I hope that I am not saying anything new when I remark that rho delta omicron zeta, rose, and forma, form, are the same word and relate to each other just like renes, kidneys, and yeren, horse and ros, steed. Likewise that among the similarities of Greek with German, one of the most significant is that in both the superlative is formed by st, iota sigma tau omicron zeta, whereas this is not the case in Latin. I would sooner doubt that the etymology of the word arm, por, is already known, namely that it comes from epsilon rhoeta mu omicron zeta, Aramis, Italian erma, for arm means where there is nothing, thus desolate, empty. Jesus Syriac 21 for epsilon rhoeta mu omicron upsilon sigma alpha iota 4 to make poor. On the other hand, that unter than, subject, comes from the Old English thane, vassal, which is frequently used in Macbeth, is hopefully already known. The German word luft, air, comes from the Anglo-Saxon word which is preserved in the English lofty, high, the loft, the attic, legranier, in that people initially designated by luft merely the upper part, the atmosphere, just as the Anglo-Saxon erst, first, has retained its general meaning in English, but in German has only remained in first, prince, princeps. Furthermore, I consider the words Aberglauben, superstition, and Aberwitz, madness, to have arisen from Überglauben, overbelief, and Überwitz, overwit, through the mediation of Oberglauben, upper belief, and Oberwitz, upper wit, like Lieberrad, dear coat, Oberrock, overcoat, Überhand, upper hand, Oberhand, upper hand. And then through corruption of the D into A, as conversely in argwon, suspicion, instead of argowon. Likewise, I believe that hahurii, hooliganism/riot, is a corruption of honorai, mockery, which the latter is preserved in English as a shout of derision, o honorii. It appears in letters and journals of Lord Byron, with notices of his life by Thomas More. London 1830 Volume 1, page 441. In general, English is the storeroom in which we rediscover our obsolete words and also the original meaning of those still in use. For example, the aforementioned first in its original meaning, the first princeps. In the new edition of the original text of the Deutsche Theologie, German theology, many words are known to me and are only understandable through English. That ivy comes from Evo will surely not be a new idea? Es kostet Michigan, it costs me, is nothing more than a rare and precious linguistic error accredited by prescription. Kosten to cost, comes just like the Italian cost or from constar. Es kostet Michigan, is thus me constat instead of mihi constat. This lion costs me should not be said by the menagerie owner, but only by the one who is being devoured by the lion. The similarity between colubr, snake, and colibri, hummingbird, must be entirely coincidental, or else, since hummingbirds only occur in America, we would have to seek their source in the prehistory of the human race. As different, indeed opposed, as both animals are, since the hummingbird often becomes the preda colubri, prey of the snake, one could still think of a confusion here, analogous to the one in consequence of which akoit in Sanskrit does not mean vinegar but oil. Moreover, we find even more striking correspondences between some originally American names and those of European antiquity, such as between the Atlantis of Plato and Aztlan, the old, native name of Mexico, which is still present today in the names of the Mexican cities Mazatlan and Tematlan, and between the high mountain Sarata in Peru and the Sorax, Idil Sorat, in the Apennines. I know that Sanskrit-educated linguists are proceeding quite differently than I am in deriving etymology from its sources, but I still maintain the hope that my dilettantism in the matter has managed to pick up a few fruits that were left over. Appendix of related passages. The French, including the academies, deal disgracefully with the Greek language. They take words from it only to disfigure them. They write, for example, etiology, esthétique, and so on, while the AI is pronounced in French exactly as it is in Greek. Furthermore, bradype, Edipe, Andromaque, and similar cases, meaning they write the Greek words as a French peasant boy who had overheard them from a foreigner would write them. It would be quite gracious if the French scholars would at least pretend to understand Greek. But to see the noble Greek language brazenly mutilated in favor of such a disgusting jargon as the French language, this Italian, corrupted in the most repulsive way with the hideous final syllables and the nasal sound, is in itself a sight like the great West Indian spider devouring a hummingbird, or a toad a butterfly. Footnote, asterisk, added by Schopenhauer elsewhere ad vocem French language. This most wretched Romance jargon, this worst mutilation of Latin words, this language, which ought to look up with reverence to its older and much nobler sister, Italian, this language, which has the disgusting nasal sounds n, on as its exclusive property as well as the conclusion of sounds, the unspeakably repulsive accent on the last syllable, while all other languages have the softly and soothingly effective. Long penult, this language in which there is no meter but only rhyme and mostly on a or ou, constitutes the form of poetry, this miserable language. The editor, I wish that the illustres confrères, as the gentlemen of the Academy call each other, would take the matter into consideration and desist from this childish barbarity, and either leave the Greek language in peace and make do with their own jargon, or use the Greek words without mutilating them, all the more so since, with their distortion of them, one has difficulty guessing the Greek word thus expressed and thereby unraveling the meaning of the expression. This also includes the highly barbaric fusion of a Greek word with a Latin word, customary among French scholars. Such things, my illustres confrères, smell of barber apprentices. I am fully justified in this censure, for political boundaries matter as little in the Republic of Letters as they do in physical geography, and language boundaries exist only for the ignorant, and fools, Noten, should not be tolerated in it. Our current Germanists, footnote, asterisk, according to an essay in the Deutsche Viertelgerschrift 1855, October to December, divide the German Diask language into branches such as 1. The Gothic branch, 2. Nordic i.e. Icelandic from which Swedish and Danish originate, 3. Low German from which Plattdeutsch and Dutch originate, 4. Frisian, 5. Anglo-Saxon, 6. High German, which is supposed to have appeared at the beginning of the 7th century and is divided into Old, Middle, and New High German. This whole system is by no means new, but was already established by Wachter, Specimen Glossarii Germanici, Lips. 1727, see Lessing's Colicania, Volume 2, page 384, likewise with the denial of Gothic origin. I believe, however, that there is more patriotism than truth in that system, and I confess to the system of the honest and insightful Rask. Gothic, descended from Sanskrit, is divided into 3 dialects, Swedish, Danish, and German. Nothing is known to us of the language of the old Germans, and I permit myself to surmise that it may have been different from the Gothic, and thus from ours. We are, at least linguistically, Goths. But nothing angers me more than the expression, Indo-Germanic languages, i.e. bringing the language of the reindeer under one umbrella with the forced jargon of the aforesaid lazy louts. Binos poma natamus. We apples swim. Furthermore, the so-called Germanic or more correctly Gothic mythology along with the Nibelungen sagas and so on were found to be much more developed and genuine in Iceland and Scandinavia than among our German lazy louts, and the Nordic antiquities, grave finds, runes and so on compared with the German ones, testify to a higher development of every kind in Scandinavia. It is striking that no German words are found in French as they are in English, even though France was occupied by Visigoths, Burgundians and Franks in the 5th century and Frankish kings ruled it. Niedlich, nice/pretty, from the old German Reidlich equals enviable. Teller, plate, from patella. Viande, meat, French, from the Italian vivanda. Spada, espada, épée, sword, from sigma pi alpha theta eta, sword, used in this sense for example by Theophrastus in the Characters, chapter 24, pi epsilon rho iota delta epsilon iota lambda iota alpha, concerning cowardice. Ape, German, from Afer, African. Because the first apes brought to the Germans by Romans were explained to them by this word. Cram, mess/junk, German, from capro alpha mu alpha, kappa epsilon rho alpha nu nu upsilon omega, mixture/to mix. Taumeln, to stagger, from temulentus, drunk. Vulpus, fox, Latin, and wolf, German, are probably somehow related, based on the confusion of 2 species of the genus Canis. Welsh, foreign/romance, is highly probably just another pronunciation of Gaelish, Gaelic, i.e. Celtic, and among the Old Germans meant the non-Germanic or better non-Gothic language, which is why it now means specifically Italian, thus the Romance language. Broad bread comes from beta or Romeo alpha. Volo, I want, Latin, and beta omicron upsilon lambda omicron mu alpha iota or rather beta omicron upsilon lambda omega, I want, Greek, are the same word at the root. The German word gift, poison, is the same word as the English gift. It comes namely from geben, to give, and means what is given, eingeben word hence also vergeben, to give away, instead of vergiften, to poison. Hoot, today, and oggi, today Italian, both come from hodi, today Latin, and yet have no similarity to each other. Parler, to speak Italian, probably comes from perlator, messenger, ambassador, hence the English, a parley. To die obviously relates to delta epsilon upsilon omega, delta epsilon iota nu, to wet/drench, just as tree relates to delta rho upsilon, oak/tree. From Gerhuda, the eagle of Vishnu, Geyer, vulture. From mala, cheek/jaw Latin, maul, muzzle/mouth German. Käse, cheese German, is the contracted catus. Shand, shame, from scandalum which is perhaps related to the Sanskrit, scandala, shandala, outcast. Ferkel, piglet, from verculum because it comes whole to the table. Plaren, to bawl/wail, from pleurer, to cry French, and plorare, to lament Latin. Fullen, foal, from pullus, chick/young animal Latin. Poison, poison French, and ponzanma from potio, drink/potion Latin. Baby is bambino. Brand, fire/brand German, Old English, brando Italian. Knife and canif, penknife French, are the same word, of Celtic origin. Ziffer, cifra, schiffer, cipher, probably comes from the Welsh, thus Celtic, ciffernac, mystery. Pictet, Mystere de Bards, page 14. The Italian tuffer, to submerge, and the German taufen, to baptize, is the same word. Ambrosia seems related to amriti, amrita, immortality drink. The Aeson, Acer, Norse gods, perhaps with Isa. Lambda alpha beta epsilon tau nu omicron mu alpha iota, to babble/talk nonsense, is identical in sense as well as in word with labburn, to babble/chatter. Lambda o lambda epsilon iota nu is alle, all. Seve, sap/juice French, is soft juice German. It is indeed strange that Geist, spirit, is the inverse of z, goat. The English bower, arbor equals bower, our birdcage/aviary. The editor. *. The above etymological remarks were found individually added to this chapter.